Hi everyone, thanks Kieran, and thanks to everyone from the Gathering Voices team for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I've been asked to update you all on the current legal developments that impact on trans, non-binary and other gender diverse people. I've called this little talk Moving Our Clear Queer Vision Towards Reality, but I should have added step by frustratingly slow step. I should say by way of introduction that I'm a Christian and a trans person, but also relevantly for this talk, I'm a human rights lawyer and an equality and civil liberties campaigner. I'm an advocacy director at Liberty, a civil liberties organisation that campaigns across a wide range of equality, human rights and social justice issues, including trans rights. No matter how far or close you've been to the debate that's been raging on Twitter and elsewhere about Gender Recognition Act reform, you're probably aware that there's been a lot of talk about whether trans people should be able to self-diagnose or self-ID, as it's known, or whether there has to be some kind of medical or bureaucratic process first to enable someone to live fully in a gender or gender role that doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. The reality is that that's a false question. Trans people have lawfully been able to self-ID forever. You can change your name, your passport, driving licence and so on without legally changing the sex on your birth certificate. The idea has been put about by gender-critical feminists and others who oppose trans rights that the government's recent consultation about law reform, issued a couple of years ago, would have resulted in a change to the importance of legal sex or to change the way that single-sex services could operate. That's simply not true. The proposal was to simplify the process of getting a certificate, but the consequence was never going to be to change how single-sex spaces operate. That comes under a completely different piece of legislation, which I'll come to in a minute. The Gender Recognition Act allows trans people to apply for a gender recognition certificate. A GRC enables a binary trans person to have the sex marker on their birth certificate changed to reflect their correct gender. The process is slow, legalistic, and inaccessible. Criteria include a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and 2 years of evidence at having lived in their acquired gender. So the GRA restricts gender recognition for all but a few who have the means to navigate such a complex and medicalised system. It also makes no provision at all for people under 18 or for non-binary people, and it makes the process for married trans people more complex too. In 2004, the Act was groundbreaking. Now it's outdated and it's cruel. So the reforms that were consulted upon were merely about making the process easier, less medicalised, quicker and cheaper. As you may have heard, the government's recently announced that it's not going ahead with those changes. There will be small administrative improvements to the process of legal recognition. The fee will be reduced to a nominal amount and the process will move online. It's tinkering around the edges at best, not proper reform. It is a step in the right direction, but a teeny-weeny tiny step. Some anti-trans campaigners see this as a victory, and it is absolutely a wasted opportunity. But what will remain the same is that trans people will continue to live in their affirmed gender regardless of whether they've gone through the legal process of changing the gender marker on their birth certificate, whether they've changed the name and gender on their passport, driving licence, NHS records, anything in fact except their birth certificate, simply by completing a change of name deed poll. What we need to focus on now as a community is how we can better support trans people to access healthcare and other essential services. Waiting lists for a first appointment at a gender identity clinic have now hit 4 years. Trans people are being attacked and vilified in the media as if they pose some kind of threat, very much like the narratives surrounding gay men and other queer people 20 or 30 years ago. Trans women are much more likely to be unemployed or in precarious employment and to be involved in sex work than cis people of either gender. The health, social and economic impact of living as a trans person in the current transphobic climate can be severely damaging to many. And yet we know from recent research and from the government's consultation itself that the vast majority of people in this country support trans rights. Over 2/3 support the complete demedicalisation of legally changing gender, and almost no one believes that trans women should be excluded from women's bathrooms. You would be forgiven for thinking the reverse, that that's a mainstream view, given the amount of noise a very small number of people in the media manage to create. So let's unpick that a bit. We've already established that trans people can and do live entirely in their affirmed gender without any need for a GRC, or indeed for any medical transition if that's what they want, or if they're on an interminable waiting list. Single-sex spaces, like public toilets, are lawfully accessed by trans people with or without a GRC every single day without remark or incident. The relevant law here is nothing to do with the Gender Recognition Act. It's the Equality Act 2010. That's the legislation that protects everyone from discrimination because of their protected characteristics. Those include age, disability, gender reassignment, race, religion or belief, sex, sexual orientation, and also now marriage and civil partnership and pregnancy and maternity. Under the Equality Act, you're protected from discrimination at work, when you're using public services like healthcare or education, when you're buying services and goods like in shops and restaurants, and in most other non-private interactions. Discrimination, as you probably all understand, is treating one person worse than another person because of their protected characteristic. So, for example, because they're a man or a woman, or because they're bisexual, or because they're trans. But indirect discrimination is also unlawful. That's when an organisation puts a rule or a policy or a way of doing things in place which has a worse impact on someone with a protected characteristic than someone without one. So, for example, a rule banning all head coverings in a workplace would have a greater impact on Muslim women and would probably be unlawful indirect discrimination, though not targeted specifically at them. The Equality Act is full of exceptions and exemptions, rules that set out in what circumstances it's lawful to discriminate. For example, there's an exception that allows churches only to recruit Christians as ministers. There's one that allows positive discrimination in specific circumstances too, for example, so as to provide training only to people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, or to provide an advice service only to LGBT people, and so on. The one that's become unnecessarily controversial over recent years is the one that permits organisations to provide single-sex services, like women-only changing rooms or domestic violence refuges. The general rule under the Equality Act is this: if you're accessing a service provided for men only or women only, the organisation providing it should treat you according to your gender identity. In very restricted circumstances, it is lawful for an organisation to provide a different service or to refuse the service to someone who is trans. In the jargon of the Act, someone who is undergoing, intends to undergo, or has undergone gender reassignment. It has to be proportionate to do so, and there has to be a good reason. In practice, this rarely causes any issues. Women's organisations happily provide services to trans women in the vast majority of cases. So what does need to happen next, and what can each of us do to help? As a non-binary person myself, I'm acutely aware of how little protection I have in law. None of the provisions I've talked about today apply unequivocally to non-binary folk. Insofar as the GRA is concerned, we just don't exist. Binary trans is where it's at if you want a GRC. There's no such thing in the UK, legally speaking, as an X or neutral gender or sex marker. As for the Equality Act, we still don't really know. For years, lawyers have argued whether we come in the definition. We know you can be at any stage in the transition process, but whether being non-binary counts, or whether only people who transition or want to transition from one gender to another, e.g. from female to male, whether they're covered is disputed. Very recently, an employment tribunal found that a worker was protected under the Equality Act as a non-binary person, but that ruling doesn't yet mean that other tribunals or courts will reach the same view. Time will tell, but it would be better if non-binary people were specifically protected. Trans young people are also very badly served both by the law as it stands and by health, education and other services. The issues are many, and I don't have time to go into that in detail, so my recommendation on that is to do what you can to help support Mermaids or Gendered Intelligence. They're both great organisations doing practical things to help young people and their families, and lobbying to change the law too, so check them out. But the main thing you can do for all trans people is to stand up for us. When you hear or see a misunderstanding or downright meanness, say something. Most of you here, if not all, will be in that very large proportion who fully support trans people's rights to access healthcare safely and promptly, to be protected from transphobic hate and violence, and to go about their business in peace. But the gender-critical hate mongers are loud, organised and energetic. We need a loud, organised and energetic counter-narrative to take over. We need for it to become just as anachronistic to be openly transphobic as it is to be openly racist or sexist. Stonewall and other mainstream LGBT organisations and dozens of charities and human rights campaigners are doing amazing work standing up for trans rights. Support them, visit their websites, educate yourselves, and stand up for your trans siblings. One of the best places to start doing that right now is the LGBT Consortium's Together campaign. You can find that on the hashtag #TogetherWithTrans. Thank you, and thanks for having me.